So we're very grateful to the Sciences Po Alumni Association. Brevity is a sort of wit. So thank you so much, Karoline. I've known Karoline for many years. She's a leading expert not only on Japan, but on conceptualizing international relations and the global conversation. You've had a resume online, so I won't repeat it. So the floor is yours for about half an hour, and then we'll do the Q&A.
Yes? Well, thank you, Robert, for the invitation. Thank you. Yes, Karoline Postel-Vinay is head of our Sciences Po Alumni Association. She's actually the one behind the talk. She asked me to come and give this talk, and then Robert has been doing this for a while now in Tokyo to organize debates, which I think is a wonderful activity. I mean, it has been growing, and it's quite wonderful activity. So my field is really it has been Japan, and from Japan I moved to international relations. So my view of international relations, I guess, has been influenced by my my experience in Japan, which is to look at the world from a hopefully non-Eurocentric. Okay, there's a problem. What is it?
I just hold the mic.
Okay. Oh, do you hear me? Oh, I see. Now you hear me. Should I start over again? Well, I was just saying briefly, I don't know what you caught and didn't catch, is that I've been studying, I was a student in Kyoto Dainaku in Kyoto something like 30 plus years ago, and then I moved from Japanese politics to international relations, but I think my view and the way I understand the international system has been influenced by the fact that I discovered the world through my experience of Japan and being also based in Europe. So what I'm trying to do is make sense of the world from a non-Eurocentric view, as far as I can do that. But what I want to talk about today is the anniversary of 1945, with a question mark about whether we're getting into a turbulence zone or not. But I want to focus also on the narrative. So what I do here, because there are so much assumption about what this anniversary should be, I will start by showing you, telling you what this presentation is about and not about. I use this famous painting by René Magritte. It's a famous painting that he did in 1928, and it's called La Trahison des Images, the treason of images. This is not a pipe. This is not a pipe. So what I'm going to do today is not about what you think, which is, as soon as you pronounce the word history in Japan and elsewhere, I mean around here, it seems that inescapably you're bringing up the issue of Sino-Japanese tensions or tensions between Japan and its neighbors. So of course we might end up discussing about these issues because I sort of invited that in the sense that I put that title "Trouble Ahead," but what I would like to do is to look at the question of 1945 and that anniversary from a broader perspective, which would be not only European perspective, but truly something that would be beyond a sort of narrow, informed by culture and nationalistic views of the problem. So what I'm not going to do, although it would be an obvious thing to do, and again we might discuss this later on, is not like is Abe Prime Minister, what kind of speech is he going to give in August this year? Is his speech going to be different or worse than Murayama or same or whatever than what Murayama Prime Minister gave in back in 1995 for the 50th anniversary of 1945. So I'm not going to talk either about the Kono statement. Is this government going to respect the Kono statement, or all that specifics that are very important, of course. This is not exactly the discussion I'm suggesting. What I want to do is to understand what it means, what this anniversary means from the point of view of international relations, what it means from the point of view of living together in this world, from the point of view of global dialogue. Because this is one of my points, my starting point is that whether we like it or not, this question of the 70th anniversary, that's a global conversation. We might not like that, but maybe some people around Abe might not like that fact. But if you look at what has been happening this week at the United Nations, and I will come back to that, it's quite obvious that it is something that we are discussing together at some global level. How should we commemorate this event, and what should we do, etc. So these are going to be my main points. First of all, I will talk about the normative concern. By normative, you might think of ethical, but I'm really thinking of norms. And well, I will come back to that, but the idea is that there's a global discussion, and that global discussion has normative implications. It has, ethical implications. Then I want to move to the question of 1945 as a narrative. It is a global narrative, and I will come back to what this narrative is about, our commonly sense as a narrative. And then I want to move to the idea. This is a little bit more conceptual, but it is very important, I think. What are so-called world events, and what is a global narrative? It is not as obvious as we might think. So, and it has very, it might look conceptual, but it has very, very practical implications. And then I will move on to the question of label. There are alternative names for World War II. This is not the only name given to that war, and what does it mean? And then I want to move to the timeline issue. What are the events we are talking about? What are the historical dates that define that war? And then I want finally to move to the question of the legacy. Obviously, there's a legacy of 1945, and it's often much more implicit than explicit in that very commemoration, in the very way we commemorate 1945. So, the first point, the normative concern. Well, I said I wasn't going to get into the specifics of, what the Abe government is doing or not doing, and what are the speculation about whether he will, do or not do. I'm thinking not only of the speech in August, but also whether he goes to the Yasukuni Shrine, and what he does, what the government does in general around that date. So again, but just I'm not getting into the specifics, but what I want to stress here is that there's, of course, a concern about what the Japanese government is going to do. But what I would like to say is that there's a clear difference in that concern about, what the government is doing and not doing. There's a difference between the concern expressed by a country, let's say, let's say, China, like we saw this week, and I guess countries in Europe or North America or in some other parts of the world. So to come back to what happened this week, I don't know if you followed that, China is the rotating president of the United Nations Security Council, and has opened a debate on the commemoration not only of 1945 but the establishment of the United Nations. And well, there has been already some tough exchanges between the Chinese ambassador to the UN and the Japanese ambassador to the UN. And one of the things that the Chinese ambassador said was that the charter of the United Nations should be respected, and the spirit of the United Nations should be preserved. And of course, if you look into the detail, some aspect of that charter of the United Nations, well, Japan and actually Germany are still referred to in that charter as enemy states. They are still within the main document of the main international cooperation organization. Japan and Germany are so-called enemy states. And this is something, the Chinese government, not in a very subtle way, referred to. So what I think is a little bit different from the perspective of other members of the Security Council is that, well, of course, they're not doing much, I have to say. Neither, well, Russia obviously is not closing up to, is getting close to China's position. I mean, China has been trying to convince Russia to be on its side on this debate, but and the UK and the US have been reacting rather coldly. But it's true that neither the US or the UK or France, for that matter, are not doing much to change the charter. But I think there's the general assumption within Western powers is that, of course, neither Germany nor Japan are a threat to us. They are not enemy states. There's no threat of war coming from, there are not enemy states. This is the paradox, that we're not doing much to change the charter, but we definitely not considering Japan and not trying to say or imply that neither Japan or Germany are any kind of enemies. So the concern, I was going back to the normative concern. The concern then, what is the concern? The concern, for example, if the Prime Minister visits Yasukuni on August, the concern is not, of course, we don't think that Japan is going to attack anyone or anything, but it's whether Japan is willing to share the same narrative. And that narrative has ethical implications. And the question is whether our allies are going to deny or oppose that ethical or moral position. So let's say, getting away from the Asian situation, for example, if you have people in Europe who are, let's imagine a government in Europe that denies the reality of the Holocaust. Hungary, for example, let's say the government of Hungary would be saying that the Holocaust did not exist or diminished the reality of the Holocaust. Well, we are not going to say, okay, this country is going to wage war. It's not because people are saying that this and that on the 19 massacre. We're not thinking that because you said this and that about the 19 massacre, that it didn't exist or it wasn't such a big deal, that the country is going to invade China. This is ridiculous. But this is probably a big difference between China, or what China is saying, and other countries. But But if people say that the Holocaust did not exist or it wasn't such a big deal, then we have a serious problem of worldview. We have a problem of shared values and norms. And they think, this is why I say there is a normative concern, I think. And now, so the normative concern and the problem about sharing the same values and norms, in this case of the anniversary, is directly linked to actually sharing the same global narrative. And this is where it gets a little bit complex, because in 1945, if you think of 1945, you imagine something, and de facto there's a global imagination, a global narrative about 1945. And this is, I'm talking about, story, narrative, imagination that actually have an impact on real politics. Now, if you look at history and sociology or sociopolitical realities, you could argue, and actually I will do that, that 1945 doesn't mean the same thing in Germany, in Japan, or in Europe and in Asia. That's I think, an argument that can be made. And 1945 doesn't mean the same thing also in Africa or in Latin America. So I will come back to this question, because there's a real problem of imagination and narrative about 1945. But at this stage, what I want to say is that even though, in terms of the historical facts, the historical reality, the socio-political reality of what actually happened on the ground around the world in that year is very diverse, but we do have a common story about it, and that converge to a certain situation. I would say, especially because everybody is always making the comparison between Japan and Germany, I would say, yeah, they were comparable up to a point, in the sense that, well, the two countries obviously were part of the same axis. They both had regimes that were internally totalitarian, externally aggressive, but they also had a lot of dissimilarities, I think. And to start with, regional histories. I mean, the history of East Asia and the history of Europe in the 30s has just, or starting with the 19th century, has just nothing to do with that of Europe. And the regional environment was just very different. So obviously, what happened on the ground around the world was different. What happened in Japan and Germany were different. All of that is very dissimilar. But despite all those differences, we do have a global imagination narrative, because at the end of the day, there was a common conclusion of the war on each side, and that was the establishment of the United Nations. So basically, the very core of 1945 as a global narrative is the establishment of that United Nations. And this organization, this is happening, this is the signing of the charter, the famous charter that still says, that said at the time that Japan and Germany were our enemies, and it's still saying that. That organization is still with us. And it had, at the time, a very powerful story, narrative, about the war, and it was about bad guys and good guys, and that was all very clear. And it was a whole history about fighting freedom, even though Stalin, well, anyway, I will come back to that. But, so, this, I think, in my view, should be modified. I mean, this is part of the discussion, maybe, but the fact that Japan and Germany are still referred as bad guys in the charter should be, I mean, it's just an aberration. Now, it's easy to say. I think the difficulty, the difficulty that the United Nations and the members of the UN as a community have to reform themselves. I mean, it's a very, that's another story, the whole story of the reform of the UN and the United Nations. I won't get into that specifically because it's really a different issue, but it is very significant. We know that the UN has a big problem to reform. But what we can see is that on the one hand, there's a legacy of 1945, of the United Nations, which is huge. It's all about, the way we deal with wars today and post-conflict has a lot to do with that legal and normative legacy. It's been very useful. I mean, the Tokyo trial, the Nuremberg trial are useful today to, like post-war in the former Yugoslavia, etc. But we know also that, even though this is not debatable, I think, the problem that the UN has to reform has to do with structural problems. Obviously, it's a big organization, it's very, very difficult to change like that. But it also points and shows the limits of that global narrative that sustain the organization. We still have the 5 people of World War II in the Security Council. This is, a very white, lots of white people there, and not many women. As a woman, I'm very, it's very shocking. And that, that kind of narrative is still there up to a point. And I think also what it points to, and this is the more conceptual discussion, I won't go too much into that, but I want to stress it, is that the very notion of global narrative of world event is problematic. I'll just give a few examples, and moving away from World War II or 1945. Take a world event as 1989. 1989 is the fall of the Berlin Wall. People would say, in 1989, that was a world event. It changed the whole, face of the world. Yes, but now, 25 years after that, what about Korea? What did it change exactly? So was the fall of the Berlin Wall the fall of all walls? As we put it back in Europe, 10 years after, at the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and 10 years afterwards, and 20 years afterwards, we were thinking this is, the center of the world. We've changed everything. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the end of all wars. Well, maybe not. And was it really the end of history worldwide? So what about Latin America? How come the transition towards democracy in Latin America happened actually in the early 80s, like 10 years before the end of the so-called Cold War? So you see, what we call world event is problematic if you take the example of the so-called Cold War. And Cold War as a narrative is also a contested narrative. And that was from the start, almost the start, when the non-aligned movements, the people like in Indonesia and India, Nehru, etc., started to say, well, listen, maybe you're talking about East-West confrontation, but we're more thinking in terms of North-South confrontation. So we don't really buy your story of Cold War. So this is an example of a world event that has been contested, and a narrative that has been contested. And I'll give you another example, which is World War I, which it's called World War, but was it really global? It's interesting to note, and I won't get too much into that, but there has been discussion also on the way we should commemorate so-called World War I, which, by the way, now, with the 100th anniversary of World War I, people in Great Britain would go back to the first name, which was Great War. And in France, we call it the Grande Guerre, which is also a Great War. And by the way, the very name World War I, World War, was used in France only in the 1930s. The first time it appeared was early 1930s, so like 10 years after the real war. So the idea that it actually encompassed the whole countries of the world has to be discussed. When we did the commemoration in France of World War I, we invited all countries in the world And then it was a little bit, funny, because this is what François Hollande wanted to do. But you had countries that were completely colonized during World War I, and the nations didn't really were part of any decision. Anyway, this is just to give you an idea of how problematic this whole notion of what is really global, what is really worldwide, etc. is. The name, by the way, World War, was created by the United States when they came to Versailles for the negotiation in 1919. And the Germans called it Weltkrieg. They called it World War because it went with Weltpolitik. They had this notion of being, having a world vision. So, back to World War II, same can be said about World War II. There are different labels for that war. See, we had this discussion a little bit ahead of this presentation with Robert, about how are you going to call this? What are you talking about? Well, yes, there are, several ways of calling it. The Chinese, and this has been changing a bit, but right now it's all about, they don't call it World War II, they call it War of Resistance against Japan. And I was interested to see that now, this week, at the United Nations, the Chinese ambassador said, it's the World Anti-Fascist War. So, there's a lot in the label, of course. In Japan, well, at the time, before it blew into a real war, there were incidents. And then, as you know, actually, of course, you're familiar with Japan, it was the Greater East Asian War. And then after 1945, there were different names as well. There was the Pacific War, some people call it World War II, but it's also, as you know, the 15 Years War. And the Second Sino-Japanese War in some cases. In Germany, again, it was from the start of Weltkrieg. It was a world war, and it went with Hitler's vision of, we had a world vision, and we had a world Weltpolitik, a world politic, etc. In France, interesting, Free France, General de Gaulle called it a guerre mondiale from the start, because he had to convince the French to get into the war, saying, this is a guerre mondiale, this is a world war, and you have to get involved. The stakes are that high. It's a world problem. So he uses guerre mondiale. Obviously, the Vichy France was not a war, and then afterwards, it was a world war. In Great Britain, Churchill didn't call it a world war. He said it was the second Great War. And he actually decided to call it a Second World War only when he published his memoirs in the United States. And the American publisher insisted and said, there was some discussion about how he was going to call his memoirs. And Churchill finally understood that if he wanted to sell it to the American public, he had to call it the Second World War. And this is when, after 1945, more or less, the idea that it was a world war started to spread. Now in Russia, when the Soviet Union got involved in that war, Stalin from the beginning called it the Great Patriotic War. Why? Well, if you're familiar with the Russian history, the war against Napoleon was the Patriotic War. It was the war of Russia. In order to get those 20 million Russians, Soviet people involved and killed in that war, it was all about Mother Russia, all in a sudden, in 1941. So it had, it had to be a reference to saving the land, etc. And for a long time, sometimes in Russia today, it's also called World War II because of the global norms and global narrative. Is there something wrong with my microphone? Oh, okay, I have to speed up. Okay, I have to speed up. Timeline, quickly. The Chinese century of humiliation started in 1839 and ends with the victory of Mao Zedong. Now I did just have a quick look to see how complicated it is. It started, did it start, if you call it the 15 Years' War, then it started with the invasion of Manchuria. If the second Sino-Japanese War, it's obviously the Marco Polo Bridge. The Second Great War in Europe really started in 1939, and then we didn't call it a world war. For the US as well as Germany, it was Second World War from 1941. And this is when, you know, Germany invades Soviet Union. You have to, I just want to stress that the official war declaration by China to the Chinese declaration of war against Japan was only 1941. Then the end of World War II, 1945, was also the end of colonization of Taiwan and Korea, but a lot of colonies went back to Europe, like Indonesia, and didn't go back to the actual people of those countries. Some countries became independent as early as 1945 or 1946, but many countries, especially in Africa, didn't get independent for a long time. And I want to stress this aspect of the war. You see, there are so many time frames involved, and there's a certain way of looking at things. And the colonial aspect has been completely undermined, and some aspect of the war within Western countries, like the US, has been completely forgotten. They do know, for example, that, well, in the US you have this image of the good war. I mean, American historians have defined the Second World War as the good war. Meanwhile, as early as 1945, there was a campaign by African Americans called Double Victory Movement, Double V. The Double V was about democracy abroad. Okay, we're fighting fascism with our government, and we're going to give our blood and life to fight German or Japanese fascism, but we want democracy at home. We don't have civil rights. And so that was a very important movement. And this whole thing about what were African Americans' situation during the war, that was acknowledged and reckoned with only very recently. It took an African American president, Obama, to actually acknowledge the contribution of African Americans in the war. What I want to say is that, there is, to come back to what Japan will do, not do, what Koreans could do, not do. There's also a challenge for the Western powers. Obviously, well, the Koreans could also look at their own collaboration, I think, during the Japanese occupation or colonization. So I think everybody can look at what they've actually done. And there's a sort of minimum about recognizing, crime against humanity, atrocities. But I think we can move a little bit forward. Like we've started in France, for example, to realize that, well, actually, May 8th, 1945, that was the end of the war for us. But it was also a huge massacre in Algeria, the Sétif massacre, where a lot of Algerians were killed because they wanted independence from France. And there were, thousands of people were killed. And we're starting now, only now, to realize, well, maybe the point of view of Africa is a little bit different on this so-called world war. And this is the challenge I want to talk about. It is a very ambitious challenge. We have to, there's a fundamental legacy of 1945, which is fighting for human dignity, let's say, and moving away from that sort of fundamental thing is a regression. If you say that Nanking massacre did not exist, it is a regression. There's no question about that. But what I'm saying is to go even beyond, move even forward, which is not only recognizing the very basic thing, the ethical legacy of 1945, but have a more ambitious definition of humanity. So this is my conclusion. I'm going back to France. Realistic utopia. I think this is, we have no other choice than to what in May 1968, the people in the street were saying, soyons réalistes, demandons l'impossible. We have to be realistic. We have to wish for the impossible. This is our only solution now. We have to move forward. And I think it's the only way forward now, because it looks so locked and difficult. Everybody's, you know, the UN is locked, the Chinese position is completely locked. I think the only solution is to reach for the impossible now. Thank you. That's it.
Just for my people.
Okay, thank you very much, Karoline. Sorry to rush through with this very dynamic audience. So just to let you know, if you have a question, you should walk to the mic, and we'll move the mic here. And then any of the two front rows are in the camera field of view. So here it is. So okay, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and then you'll walk up, and so it'll be easier to
we
report.
can have this
It's
go
technically easier apparently for reasons that are beyond my understanding. So, who has a question? I promised the most dynamic set of questions. Okay, yes. So, one of you come up to the mic.
I simply thought that summer should kick off. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's so nice to listen to European who speak without any cliche or hope. Thank you. Now, I have one question. Oh, actually, a couple of comments and a very important question. You mentioned about the massacre of Algeria, and you might recall that when the Queen of Netherlands visited Japan, it was a president for the Association of apologies for the 100,000 people massacred only in 1 month of August 1945. As far as I remember, you're the first European scholar who mentioned the massacre. And I wonder if that is a new trend among European scholars. Are they looking straightforward about the very rare quote-unquote good side? Please don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that Japan is something good. But the good side effect of the Second World War was actually the independence of those countries. Now, that is my question. My point is that, yes, when we think of PRC or RK, I feel sorry for them in the sense not apology, but compassion. Because they were not treated as winners, nor by Americans, nor by British. And so they are not winners. And that irritated me. Because, as we all know, history tells us that history and justice have always been written by the winners of the then most recent war, and they were not. That means that Japan should react more shrewdly, and I might ask you that shrewdness needed by judges in this. Thanks for the time.
Should I answer one by one?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your not only nice but stimulating comments. I think there is a sort of post-colonial trend, but the way it works with the academia is that I would say international relations is much more conservative. So there's a sort of post-colonial trend, and people are trying to get less Eurocentric in social science in general. But IR tend to be incredibly Western-centric. Actually, the big conference on the international relations that takes place in North America each year that just happened last week was about having a less Western-centered view and looking at perspective. But what I would say is that it's incredibly slow for the moment. Again, I think I was influenced by my Japanese experience and to look at different perspective. It's not an easy thing, but so I would say yes. And the reason for the yes is that again, this is a necessary utopia or necessary reach for the impossible, because this is the world we're going to face anyway. So if we think we can, get away with Eurocentrism for the coming decades, I think we're, mistaken. I think that, to speak very bluntly, I think the PR done by the Japanese government today is just terrible. I think it's, the more they act like the Chinese, well, we don't expect a very sophisticated PR from China, I guess, but this is, the thing is, if you take just China, there's also the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, and they had their own history of mass violence, which is not recognized with, and also the fact that Mao Zedong just didn't care at all about, he said no reparation from Japan, and the Nanking Massacre Museum was built only after the death of Mao. So there's room for improvement from Japan about the true trueness. Definitely, there should be, there would be a great opportunity, and there are so many great minds in Japan who can do that. Maybe not in the government just now, but definitely in the country, who could raise a debate about, reclaiming our own history. Indeed, the Koreans were not, well, the Chinese were involved, in the Tokyo trial, and they had their own trials, but the Koreans were not involved. And there's an amazing opportunity to reclaim Asian history by East Asian scholars or intellectual or civil society people, and there's this richness in the intellectual life in Japan that makes it possible. It's just that I don't understand why, because Sankei Shimbun says that, and the government says that intellectuals should stop talking and think about expressing their thoughts. But I think it's completely possible that it should happen in Japan. And I hope we can help do that in Europe, because again, what I think is that we have our own cleaning to do, again, not only the massacre in Algeria, but all those things that happen in, post-colonial countries and situations. So it would be absolutely great. If the Japanese, if you and people like you would start a debate about, let's have an East Asian view of history, and specifically post-colonial view of history, and then we could participate and also learn from you and discuss this. That would be so great.
Yes.
Lucas Gauss from University of Tokyo. Thank you for your speech. Speaking of labels, I would like to ask you about, I recently read the article from one Japanese scholar who said that the problem in Japan is that the anniversary of the end of the war, of the end of the Second World War, is called, in Japanese, it's called like the end of the war, and the notion of the fact that Japan was defeated, Nihon ga maketa, is not included in that name of the anniversary. So basically, the war ended, Senso ga owatta, but Nihon ga maketa is not included in this label, in this notion. So if you think that, what do you think about it? If you agree with the idea that the label of the name end of the war influenced the thinking of Japanese people about their responsibility and the end of the war.
Yeah. Well, the thing about labels is that it's not just what make people think. It also reflects what people think. And the question is what you do with labels. Obviously, you know, for a long time, Germany was not invited to a commemoration in Europe, and there was this whole notion, you know, and the Germans weren't so keen to come, and etc. But at some point, you know, there was this idea that it was a whole commemoration about not only reconciliation, but actually moving beyond the great thing we've achieved in Europe, which is to create a space where war is not possible, which is, you know, quite an achievement. I think this is one of the, not many achievements those days in but definitely this one. So I don't think as such it's a problem, but I think it all depends what you put in that label, right? So if, you know, what's the point of, if the whole point is to say, like, what has been implied this week at the United Nations by the Chinese ambassador that, you know, Japan was defeated and it's still what it is in the charter, meaning an enemy state, then, you know, I don't think it's such a good idea to say Makeda, the Japan lost. But if it has that meaning, you know, what's the point? I don't know if I answered it.
I am Mizuno from Kanda University. I was a former correspondent in Vietnam more than 20 years ago, and about Lalvik, I had a very interesting experience, which is a power of your explanation. When I asked the Vietnamese people, how do you think of Vietnam War? They couldn't understand my question because they don't call Vietnam War. They have only anti-American war or anti-Japanese war, war against colonial powers. They have so many wars. They don't categorize one Vietnam war. So this is, I think, quite a parallel because French conquered Vietnam, as I mentioned, and even after the World War II, French came back, and some former Japanese soldiers working against French, some working for French, and former Japanese soldiers fight for each other on the side of the Vietnamese and on the side of the French. It was quite an interesting story. My question is about the post-colonial responsibility, which is, I think, post-war Japanese like me is thinking of it. And as you mentioned, that the Europeans now are thinking about the post-colonial history, not just finishing everything finished and the power started from 1945. In the case of Japan, we dismissed look back the responsibility of colonial power, and French was winner. So that's why they tried to come back to Vietnam. But in case of Japan, we were defeated. So we just dumped all the former colonies like Korea and Taiwan without taking any care of responsibility or without protecting those people. I think one worst case is comfort women, because they brought those comfort women from Korea or Taiwan all the way back to Myanmar or Saipan. And just after the war, Japanese former soldiers, the Japanese former comfort women were somehow took care by Imperial Army and government of Japan. But those comfort women who were taken from colonial places, they were just thrown away. That was, I think, one reason why this kind of history issue is still lingering even today. I would like to your comment on this.
Yeah, I would say 2 or 3 things actually. Especially comfort women, yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say generally the way the subjects of colonial powers, the way they were treated during the war, was just not taken into consideration at the Tokyo trial. So, you know, the Korean subject, the Chinese subjects, etc. And, you know, wars are not great, but the fact that there was no independence process in Korea or in Taiwan makes it, you know, all of a sudden, well, first of all, those colonies didn't came with the so-called Second World War, the Pacific War, or anything. It was, you know, way back before. So there's no reflection whatsoever on, you know, what was this colonization process about and decolonization process about. So there's something missing, and right away the two countries were divided, Taiwan and the People's Republic and the two Koreas. So something missed. As you know, you might know, on the comfort women, the violence against women was not treated at all. The International Persecution Section at Tokyo had documentation on the comfort women, and the decision was taken, you know, there were so many issues that was not taken into consideration. So there's this problem of gender, of women not taken into account. They were not, you know, there were sexual violence against women in Germany, and there was nothing about that at Nuremberg either. So I would say there was this gender problem and then indigenous problem, which is that it was actually one and only one trial against military who perpetrated sexual violence in Indonesia. I mean, in Indonesia it was the Batavia court, martial court, but that was for Dutch comfort women, and the Indonesian comfort women that were also mistreated and, you know, raped several times per day were out of that trial. So there was a crossing of gender and colonial thing. Now, I would say about comfort women and Korea, the problem, I mean, there's a huge problem around, I mean, it's a very complex, there were several situations within comfort women. Some were, you know, there were rape centers where women, and not only women, but teenagers, very young girls, who were, you know, raped and violent, you know, and sometimes killed. That happened also with the help of the Korean police in Korea. I mean, why those high school girls taken out of school, sent to whatever army front, you had to have help on the ground. And when Yoshiaki, the Japanese historian, started to do his documentation on comfort women, he was surprised how easy he had access to all the archives. And, you know, and the subject was never raised in Korea before that. It took a Japanese historian. And the problem we've seen, and as a, I mean, not, you know, as a woman, but as a person, what is, I think, very shocking now is that the way the comfort women issue is treated on both sides is a sort of national pride thing, as if, you know, this sexual violence in wars happen all the time, and it's increasing actually in Africa and former Yugoslavia. We've seen that, and people are, you know, people who are watching this are saying a rape of a woman during war is really a conversation about two men. It's really about not, you know, forgetting completely about women. And again, in this case, it's all as if, you know, Korea was raped, not the woman. Korea, the national pride of Korea, and versus the national pride of Japan. And the actual woman and people, persons, is often completely, you know, forgotten in that process. So this is why I'm saying, yeah, there's, I mean, comfort women is obviously an example of the problem of, you know, the colonial responsibility, definitely. But I think there's, on the other hand, something a little bit specific about comfort women because they are women.
Thank you for your lecture. My name is Joan Anderson from Soka International. I've sometimes wondered about whether it would be possible in Japan or in other countries to create educational opportunities, maybe even museums, that tell several parallel narratives of the same story. And that way you could get around people protesting, oh, you're only telling this story or that story, and you'd also demonstrate to people that there are different narratives. Have you ever come across anything like that?
Well, going back to the comfort women, you know, there's a museum here about comfort women, which is a private museum, which trying to tell the story from several viewpoints. There has been the thing with national museums, for example, is that they are national. And then you have so-called global things like, Universal Exhibition or whatever, but then it's always a nation or nation states that are invited. And, if you create something like a global conversation on the base of national contribution, it will be difficult. I think the way to deal, I haven't seen anything like that. And I think the way to deal with that, and my idea of a global dialogue, is to start with issues. If you start with issues instead of, I'm Japan, I'm France, I'm the US, and I gave my view on, I think as a Japanese, I think as a French. If you just, give your view on an issue like, war and violence, or memory, collective memory, or, the city, how a city commemorates history, then, then at the end of the day, your view will be informed by your nationality and your national experience, or your several national, multinational experience, whatever. And then, whatever your cultural experience will come up. But I think we have, we'll have a bigger and bigger problem with, dealing with complexity. I think this is the big, major challenge of the 21st century. And what I see is nationalism is on the rise, not only in this region. I mean, in Europe, the European election was, unfortunately, I think, a showcase for the rise of nationalism, and then, in North America as well. In all democracies, you see the rise of nationalism, which I think is a reaction to the impossibility of coping with this huge complexity, which is global dialogue. So I would say it would be a great thing, but I don't think national perspective is the answer. I think really we have to deal with common issues to start with. This is what I'm trying to say about common women. First of all, the issue of gender and and sexual violence and mass violence against women and girls, and then we'll have perspective, whatever, nationally informed.
Yes, in the back.
I would like to come back to your headline, Trouble Ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think, you appeal to the Japanese to start a negotiation, start a discussion, reclaim Japanese history, Asian history, but at the same time, the people in power at this time, of course, as you mentioned, do a terrible job in PR. On one hand, you said, but also they try to push a different narrative, it seems, than what is the common narrative. So, do you think, when we are looking now ahead to July, August, where will we have? Where can we expect troubles? I mean, with China, of course, we can expect troubles from the Japanese perspective. But what about the other countries like the United States?
Yeah, well, what we've seen so far is that the U.S. is very upset by the present government's visits to Yasukuni or statement on whatever problematic issues. So, at the end of the day, the U.S. is still Japan's big ally, although if there is any trouble with, real trouble with North Korea or the Taiwan Strait or whatever, well, we'll have to watch and see whether the U.S. will actually get involved, which is remains to be seen. But so in a way, the worst trouble would be tensions. But I was, I did a class at Tokyo in my institution this year on history as present and as conflict. And I was amazed to see that things like historical controversies can actually impact trade. That trade between South Korea and Japan has, okay, it's the economy as well, but that there's an actual impact on the economy, so what's next? The other thing is a country like South Korea, you talk to people who would be completely in favor of, years ago would be in favor of Japanese, Korean, South Korean collaboration, and are saying we feel closer to the Chinese because we have a common view on history. Which, so really, seriously, I agree that history is a big problem, and I agree that, again, all those ethical implications, and I'm completely in favor of recognizing the Nanking massacre, Catholic women, and all that. But the way that it could affect the dialogue between democracies like South Korea and Japan, I find it very worrying. And then, this is something Joseph Nye, the scholar in the US, said, that his worry, seen from where he was, that you don't know what will happen at the middle level management. And so even if the governments at the head are very clear on the fact that we don't want war, we can't go to war, when you have intense political competition or whatever, turf competition, domestic competition within a big country like China, then you might have vested interest in having tensions flare. So, I'm like everyone. I don't believe in the war, but I do believe in the unforeseen consequences of a very unstable situation. So, trouble ahead is a question mark.
Let me follow up with a question. If the Prime Minister appointed you to his panel in the 70th anniversary statement and told you you're very well educated, you're very intelligent, write it for me, what would you write for him?
How can I answer to that in a nutshell? Well, more or less what I said. Sorry.
The Prime Minister's comment.
I would get rid of the Nippon Kaigi. Where's the? Did I break anything?
No, I don't know.
Okay, should I exist this?
Very badly.
I'm sorry, I did something wrong.
I think it's critical. I think it's
He reacted. That was censorship from from technology. I would, definitely. How I understand there might be pressure from groups inside, whether the Nippon Kaigi or the Association of Veterans, etc. But do you really need to visit Yasukuni? Do we really need to make those statements? I would start with the obvious. Why do you behave like some talk like the Chinese propaganda? You can do, this is a Japanese democracy. Why do you sound like Xi Jinping? It's really terrible. I think I would, I don't understand I would start with that and see how he would react.
yes.
This is a very photo.
Oh, I think we have to exchange, and I'll give you this. We have to, you're sensitive.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sensitive. This is a very simple-minded a very simple-minded question. When you say narrative, is it is it equivalent to the concepts of equivalent to the German word Weltanschauung?
Yeah, it's sort of Weltanschauung. It's like that the Germans have those very sophisticated notions. Weltanschauung is like the whole worldview, but a narrative is two things. It's something to make sense of events. So when you have something as complicated and complex as a World War II and the end, how are you going to? What is going on with the end of World War II? This is a very complex situation, and you try to make sense of it. So you build a narrative, but the narrative is also to influence. So maybe the difference with the German concept is that here a narrative can be also a strategic narrative, and you actually there's a storytelling with the intent to put people to act in your direction. Like the whole idea of a world war that was really invented by the US. If you look at the speeches and rhetoric starting in 1917, when the US got involved in the First War, it was a clear intention. Wilson had to convince people from Ohio, Missouri, whatever, to go and Europe to actually cross the ocean and get killed for what? Alsace-Lorraine, for God's sake. How can you, in order to convince people who just didn't want to fight, and for good reason, Wilson very deliberately was actually advised by a group of bright people who said this is a huge thing. This is a world war against. At this time, it was for liberty and freedom against those old-fashioned countries in Europe. So it wasn't about territory, it was about freedom. And that narrative that was built in 1917 was sort of recycled again in 1941, 1942, where Roosevelt again had to convince people saying, you have to go back and fight for those crazy Europeans, but it was all in a sudden it was also the Japanese who attacked home. So that was sort of easier to build. But again, I mean, Roosevelt from the beginning was completely convinced that was a world war, and he used that word, whereas in Europe it wasn't that, as I said. So it's also something that's more deliberate, that you create a strategic, again, story to have people not only believe in your understanding of the situation, but actually act on behalf of what you're understanding.
Thank you for your great speech. My question is about political decision and announcement. I think, and you are talking about Roosevelt, so I'm also interested in Roosevelt's decision, which is Soviet Union and join the war. But if consider the after the World War situation, maybe if the Soviet Union didn't join the war, it's better situation for the Western countries. And also, so my question is, the political decision announcement is, it's better to balance the post previous situation and domestic and world situation. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult question. And also I cannot understand very well. For example, usually combat woman announcement probably. I'm sorry. Not on the social party, but in the LGBT, maybe she is left. So it's because she is left, and probably the previous person or expect him to say that, or like that kind of balance. So, what do you think about that? Roosevelt decision and communism, maybe and social democratic party leader maybe said apologize. So yeah, apologize to World War II or say China.
Apology. I'm not sure. But Soviet Union. I'm sure I got your question, but if you talk to people who were, behind, caught in Europe, and when they were Stalingrad, people were pretty happy that the Soviet Union joined. So I'm not sure it was a bad decision. I mean, it wasn't such a bad thing that they joined. The comfort. Well, first apologies. I was mentioning that interesting class I gave this year at my institute, and there were Chinese students. I mean, it's a very international school, and there were Chinese students, and they were saying to the other students who were either, French, Australian, American, British, etc., German, and they were saying, yes, Japan never apologized. And then, I didn't even want to argue. I just took out the list of the 23 apologies given by the Japanese government. I said, no, this is not the issue. The Japanese government has been apologizing more than 20 times. The problem is if the government the Japanese government gives an apology, and then someone goes and say, well, the comfort women, they will prostitute anyway, we don't care, etc. Then it sort of sabotaged the whole thing, So this is the problem. Although what I see back in the 1990s, when Japanese ministers would say things like that, they had to resign, and this is different now. There is something that changed. But the thing about apologies, I'm not sure what's the thing about apologies. If you keep saying them and then you say something that goes beyond that contradicts the apology, I'm not quite sure what's the use of that, and I'm not quite sure about the whole formality of the apologies. I think it's a very standardized way of doing diplomacy. I'm not sure it's the only way. I'm not completely. I'm a little bit, frankly, very honestly, I'm a little bit bewildered by what we mean with all those apologies. If we, it's not very clear to me. But what I can see is, for example, when there's the committee at the United Nations on violence against women, and the committee wants to study all kinds of cases, and they study violence against women in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, etc. And when they come up with the Japanese comfort women, so-called comfort women, then the Japanese delegates said, no, we can't study that. This is a problem. I don't care about apology, but this is a problem if we can't study what happened. You see.
And Roosevelt about
the what, sorry?
Red Soviet Union joined the war.
Oh, the Soviet Union joining the war. I said that I think it would. I don't. You're saying that it made things more complicated, of course. But I think we were. I mean, in Europe, we were very happy. That they, yeah.
Thank you very much.
James Brown, Temple University, Japan. So for obvious reasons, all the focus within Japan is on what's going to happen in August with Abe's speech. But before we get to that, of course, we have the issue of May, focused on Europe. And Russia has been planning for a long time the usual large Victory Day celebrations for the 9th of May, and it's invited all of the world's leaders. But there's now the plan from Poland to have almost rival commemorations the previous day. And in fact, the Polish president is in Japan at the moment. So I wondered what you thought the Japanese authorities were going to do about that. How are they going to position themselves on that issue?
But this is VE Day, right? This is not VJ Day. please.
Sorry, previously, in 2005, Prime Minister Koizumi attended.
Yeah, I remember that. That's true. Yeah, absolutely. But I've been listening to friends and scholars who are part of those committees around Abe, and I didn't hear anything coming out from that. So I don't have more information than you do. But what I see, which is very interesting, is how all those commemorations are sort of falling apart. When compared to the 50th anniversary, where you had a sort of consensual view, there are certain things where everybody sort of agreed, but with tension between Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Russia, I was going to say the Soviet Union, and also those post-colonial claims, you can see how it's going into all kind of directions. I mean, already the 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War was already last year quite revealing of how nationalism is also creeping in Europe, and you can see all those different position. But I'm not answering your question. But the answer to your question, what is the? I think again, I don't have the information, but I think this will be a test for Japan to position itself. Definitely, it has been, as you might know, there's a much stronger relationship now with Japan and the EU, Japan and UK, and Japan and France. So there will be an incentive for them to position themselves on those countries' positions. So that would be interesting to watch from that perspective, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for a really good talk, very global perspective. And after that excellent question, I feel I'm asking on very tiny detail. You mentioned in passing cooperation of the Korean police. Has this been published in an article, or has this just been a persistent footnote? Or
no, it has been in many documentation about what actually happened, and this is something Yoshiaki himself said, and also there's this book about gender and ethnicity in Korea, where there's this whole discussion about. I mean, there were several papers by rather brave Korean scholars, women, who said, that problem was known for a long time and nobody actually talked about it. And also, even worse than that, when the first former comfort women in Korea started to speak up in the 1990s, early 1990s, in one situation, there was one case of an old woman, obviously, a former comfort woman who had concealed that from her husband and son, and when the men of the family found out, they just rejected her and said, out of our house. So it really showed, and this episode about recently in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who said, President Park is a dirty comfort woman. So there's obviously still a very troubled relationship with this gender aspect. I mean, specifically the gender aspect. But there's been a lot of documentation, not only police with comfort women, but Koreans as guards of camps, of Japanese prisoner of wars in Japanese camps. There were hundreds of thousands of Koreans as subjects. They were subjects of the Japanese Empire who worked with the Japanese government. And this is so interesting that it was even, I remember I was living in Tokyo in those days. In the 1990s, it was even a former, a Korean guard, former guard of a Japanese POW camp who protested and said, I didn't get paid enough, or I didn't get paid or something. Saying there was this guy who was complete collaboration. I mean, a capo, we would call him in Europe, collaborating with the Japanese Imperial Army. And now people are getting a little bit more quiet about that, but of course it was a huge collaboration. I mean, this whole, the Vichy thing we had in France is not happening in Korea. I don't see it.
And looking at it logically, where would you go to get this type of human resource?
Oh, in here, and, right here in this country. Oh, you mean, oh, sorry. What's your question?
Here or Korea or anywhere.
Yeah.
Discussing it as sort of logically, there would be local involvement, but not being able to find it anywhere. So it would be under gender studies.
Oh yeah. For I mean, historians would be, well, gender studies, or also people who have been writing about Japanese occupation of Korea. And I know some scholars of Korea who have documented that, and the archives are right here in this country because everything was neatly recorded and everything. So
thank you very much.
Not a question. I just happened to be reviewing NHK news broadcasts from the last 2 weeks while I was back in Britain. They had a segment dealing with a Korean woman historian, Park Yak-koo, who spent a number of years researching the comfort women. And she came to the conclusion that the Japanese military was very seldom directly involved in the recruitment, that was the exceptional case, that most of the recruitment was done by what she called intermediaries, who were primarily Korean. And just recently, there was a court ruling in Korea saying that her book could not be published unless she took out those segments documenting the Korean involvement in the comfort women.
Well, I don't know what the figures are. I mean, obviously, we should. I mean, the danger, of course, with that is to erase the Japanese army responsibility, of course. I mean, at the end of the day, the orders were given by the imperial.
Oh, she's very critical.
Oh, okay, yeah, right. No, but of course, I mean, you have, how do you do that? I mean, at some level, of course, the people were completely involved on the ground. It's like, like Vichy France, the French police was very cooperative, taking the Jewish people, children, women, etc., out of the houses, of course.
We kind of reached the end of the session.
I think one slight difference with Korea, of course, that Korea was fully a colony, whereas Vichy was de facto acting on its own. I mean, there's a slight difference. I mean, I think there is a problem in Korea. It's true that there were Korean brothel owners and Korean private sector actors who were very much active in recruiting the sex life. I think it's a little different in that sense that Korea had been fully occupied. Vichy acted on its own.
Yeah, but it was
as Paxton said, it was an independent actor.
But it was such an authoritarian regime, Japan was, that the difference with being occupied by Nazi Germany and so no, I completely agree. Germany is not occupied France, and you could, when you were in Vichy camps, you could go to Nintendo or whatever outside of the Vichy occupied place. But you could do that with Korea. I mean, some people went to China.
But what I mean, there was no Korean administration.
Yeah,
there was Vichy was French. Korea was under Japanese control. But I think it's true that a big issue in Korea has been the inability to address the Korean aspect.
I just want to push the point and say, see, we know about Vichy, why don't we? But I agree, we have to be careful with. There's so much parallel we can make.
I think what I'm struck by the presentation is I think it's quite clear that in Beijing, history is rightly understood as being used for the continuation of policy, to paraphrase. I also think one problem with the Prime Minister here is that he's actually concerned about historical truth. Now, of course, that's not historical truth, it's historical truth, and I think he's not sufficiently concerned about the fact that this is not about history, it's about what Japan's national interest is. And I think that's
in a way, he needs to go back to Klauswitz.
Okay, this is like, you should see my
Spend less time.
habits.
Well, I
read Clausewitz.
no, I mean, seriously, it's a problem that I think a lot of the Japanese right here have been too concerned about the internal issue of what they perceived as pride and everything, less about
the politics, the international politics of it. What's noticeable when I think someone asked you about the U.S., one issue that is now rising in the U.S. is how Japanese war crimes against Americans were really never very important in American perceptions of World War II, because when you ask Americans about World War II, they think first and foremost of the Holocaust. And of course the US won. But now, with more coming out about the sex slaves, the entire narrative about violence against women, more activism among Korean Americans, you're starting to see monuments in the US, and it's started to affect US-Japan relations. You know, the Japanese diplomats were sent to complain about the content of this US textbook, and so it's been transferred also from Asia to the US, in a way that wasn't the case for the 50th anniversary.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, all those things about the statues in US cities of Korean conflict women, and it's taken to the law in the US, so it's, you know, directly affecting the US society now.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.